A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for this presentation titled, helps if I change screens, Stamped. It's been about a month since our last presentation, and I've had time to reflect. This is our 38th presentation. Can you believe that? And I would like you to know, wherever you're logging in from, each one is dedicated to you. So wherever you are, knowing that you're sharing more of your life encourages me to do my very best. You're giving us your time, your attention. So please know this connection is deeply appreciated. And the essence of today's story is connection. Letters are a revelation, and they're so relatable even when they're written more than 3,000 years ago. So this one from Egypt, the letter from a father to his son, which is effectively stating, you don't write enough. I'm worried about you. Why don't you write to me? And how relatable is that lament? How many children and parents have this conversation now, albeit over a text or a phone, or I guess WhatsApp or Twitter or TikTok, God knows, you have so many ways to communicate. But the filter for this presentation about human connections is letters. So correspondences that require stamps. It is personal since I treasure the written word, and every member of the Nourishment Projects receives a handwritten letter from me. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Are some of the references that inform this presentation. So when we see rock stars connecting with their throngs of admirers through fan letters, but that's not the only time, is it? Because history abounds with letters and letter writers. So we can think of Cyrano de Bergerac, Marquis de Sade, the Tale of Genji. We also, because the Tale of Genji is effectively Murasaki Shikibu's admittedly a love letter. So the various steps of this exchange between the sender and the recipient of the postal service is what is scaffolding today's presentation. A lot happens if you look at the picture between the licking of the envelope, as shown on the left, to the eventual reading of a letter, the intimacy captured by Vermeer. And in this case, one wonders, is this letter from a sibling? Is it accounts due? Or perhaps, is it a plea from a lover for a tryst? Who knows? Though one wonders, doesn't one? Today, we are taking the long view, the arc of the human connection, the back and forth, the process of delivery, along with the product, the letter itself. The framing device for our story is cinema. Penelope Steiner, you had come to mind. Starting with, you've got mail. It's actually anything but, because the title is alluding to emails. For me, emails pale in comparison to the sheer pleasure of holding something tangible, something private and singular, the handwriting, the paper, the sheer seduction of waiting for something. So this section clarifies what is not included in our story, because the correspondences in this case are not stamped. So even though they're very efficient, Instagram, things like TikTok, anything in social media, Twitter, WhatsApp, none of that is included in this presentation. Even Telegram, which is a digital messaging platform, is not included, and neither is its namesake, the traditional Telegram. Also omitted, though many are stamped, are gifts that are sent by mail. Things bought online, say, for example, Etsy, or any other vendor that is sent by post. None of that is going to be included in today's presentation. Now that the ground rules are established, let's begin, starting with process. What goes into sending a mail? The movie Charade is a most charming starting point, with the rather dapper Archibald Leach, whom you may know as Cary Grant, and the effortlessly elegant Audrey Hepburn. The movie is really delightful. Among its many, many lovely scenes is where the character of Audrey Hepburn asks Cary Grant, "Do you know what's wrong with you?" And he gamely responds, "No, what?" And she twinkles back, "Nothing." One might say that about her. Isn't she just absolutely fabulous? But in this movie, Hepburn's character is Reggie, and Reggie's husband has been murdered, and he was something of a crook himself. He had apparently died with an abundant sum of money, $250,000, that he had stolen during World War II, and his shady compatriots are determined to get it back. Hepburn can't solve the mystery of where the money actually is. And her husband's belongings that were with him during the time of his death contained common everyday items, such as passport, a pen, a stamped letter, a comb, and various other odds and ends. The mystery isn't solved until they stumble upon a market selling rare stamps, and Reggie realizes that the money was there in front of them the entire time. The stamps on the letter were worth $250,000. She then realizes that she had already given the 3 stamps on the envelope to her friend's son, Jean-Louis, for this little boy's stamp collection, thinking nothing of it at that time. Once they find Jean-Louis, the little boy brags that he had traded the 3 stamps for a whole bag full of them. So they track down the stamp collector, Mr. Felix, shown here. As they enter the man's office, he says quite simply, "I was expecting you. I knew you would come. Look at them, madame. Have you ever in your entire life seen something this beautiful?" And in an unexpected move, the collector, acknowledging the $250,000 value of the 3 stamps, simply returns them to Reggie, the character of Audrey Hepburn, saying, "I'm not a thief, madame. I knew there was some mistake. For a few minutes, they were mine. That is enough." A man of honesty and integrity. And though it seems and sounds rather perverse, stamp collectors are called philatelists. And I'm very delighted to know we have one in our midst. Welcome, Mr. Barr. And as you very well know, stamps are amazing.
We're pink, she's
Would you please mute yourself, whoever you are? It would be very helpful. Thank you. The subject of stamps deserves at least an hour. You can spend actually hours on them, but we are not going to be doing that today. We are painting with a rather broad brush, but we'll cover the basics. The penny black was the world's first adhesive postage stamp, and it was used in a public postal system in around 1840. One was just up on auction last year, around October 2021, and that one was worth slightly more than $250,000. Precisely, it was worth, sold at $8.25 million. And that exorbitant amount speaks to the rarity of the stamp, since the penny black was only printed for a year. And that's because the red cancellation was very hard to see on the black design, and the red ink was easy to remove. And both these facts made it possible to reuse the cancelled stamps. Not a good way to go if you're trying to make money off it, which the government was. So in February 1841, the British Treasury switched to the penny red and began using black ink for cancellations instead, which was more effective and harder to remove. The story of stamps is much more than money, and some have bizarre creations history. Take, for example, Ugandan stamps. In 1894, Uganda had just become a British protectorate, and George Wilson, the first government official posted there, decided that this called for an issue of stamps, and a postal service needed to be set up. So the Church Missionary Society was the only organization with a network across the country. Ernest Miller, a young Cambridge graduate, was the only missionary with a typewriter. And so in 1895, Mr. Miller sat in a hut in the depths of the bushes of Uganda, making stamps on his typewriter. So it fell on to this young man to design and make and issue the first Ugandan stamps. And the design had to be simple. Mr. Miller chose UNG as the emblem, placing one letter on either side of the stamp. And to show them both, it's on the side, but you have to imagine them vertical, not horizontal as it's been shown. So in the center, he put a figure to show how much each stamp would be worth in cowrie shell, because cowrie shell was the currency at that time. Then he took the only paper he had in hand, which was the flimsy foolscap on which he used to type his sermons, and he began to type the stamps. The stamps were available from the mission station, and letters were carried by runners wearing nothing but a loincloth. And unlike the penny black from 1840 that had adhesive on the side, these stamps that he had designed, though they were made 50 years after the penny black was issued, these stamps used to use gum from a local tree to be able to be stuck on an envelope. And I want to emphasize the story behind stamps and their formations are fascinating, very well worth your time should you investigate it. And charmingly, the runners themselves have been commemorated on stamps in many countries. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact stamps could have remained a little scrap of paper with some numbers on it. You can see the differences here. But postal administrations around the world, going back to the 1800s, decided that it should be much more than just efficient, that they be beautiful. Because if you think about it, stamps by nature, they're simply a ticket that tells the postal service that you paid for the service. So because when you're buying a stamp, you're actually buying their service, their ability to send something from point A to point B. Yet so much more goes into making a stamp than simply to make it efficient. The variety dazzles. And this is between each nation across the world. They're just bewildering, the variety and the imagination that goes into creating it. So in the United States, there's a Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee comprising 10 to 15 members who've been appointed by the Postmaster General. So the committee reviews subjects from the public that have been suggested to be designed into a stamp. And surprisingly, every year they get about 30,000 suggestions. And the odd, charming thing is you cannot suggest this by email. You have to actually write it down and mail it in, which makes perfect sense. So stamps are actually miniature works of art because they tell the best story of America. They're not just about presidents or founding fathers. And this committee, the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, shies away from disasters or events that are negative in nature. Stamps are a celebration of our country. This criteria is probably, this idea to celebrate a country is probably true for all countries as they design stamps, as well it should be. So the committee finalizes subjects 3 years in advance. So they have to be cognizant of upcoming anniversaries, moments of significance. And once a subject is finalized, the process moves on to the 4 art directors and then on to illustrators. So the United States Postal Service pays maximum of $5,000 per design because the Postal Service does not have a large budget. And in fact, one movie that calls out a design of a postal stamp is that movie Fargo with the lady who's in The Tragedy of Macbeth, Frances McDormand. At the end, her husband was designing a stamp, a mallard. I know these odd details. But the commercial artists they hire, the Postal Service hires, could be making about $75,000 to $100,000 a year. But they do these designs at a fraction of the cost, simply for the honor of creating something that is part of our national identity. And look at all the subtleties that they have to review. Because the postal stamp will not promote cigarette smoking. Look, the stamp for Jackson Pollock doesn't have the cigarette included. It's been omitted. Same is true for the one with James Dean, the cigarette out of his mouth. is not there. The rebel without a cause is also without a cigarette. So again, the story of stamp can take hours. Stamps for countries no longer exist. It's really amazing what you can find out. So in 1994, Bophuthatswana's had been incorporated into South Africa. And along with the stamp, Bophuthatswana's flag and license plates are no longer in use either. So stamps communicate history. And as we can see, the Belgian occupation of German East Africa during World War II is presented here. The French occupation of Mexico. I didn't realize that France occupied Mexico from 1861 to 1867. This one happens to be from 1866. And did you know that the actual official name for Mexico is United Mexican States, even today? So it's United, I guess, Mexican States. I didn't know that. It's not really Mexico. All the things we learn. And the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, all that affogato, cappuccino, espresso. There are no coffee plantations in Italy. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Where is this Italian love of coffee coming from? Stamps alert you to so many things. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong in World War II. Stamps truly are very informative, and they communicate our past, politics, and much more. They communicate culture. This stamp issued by France, celebrating the International Association, UNESCO. Here, the International Institution Court of Justice in The Hague. So one might wonder, how are the stamps being shown today selected? It's completely on whim. While I was doing this, I was doing a jigsaw puzzle with my children, and it was a puzzle by Escher. And I remembered the Escher Museum in The Hague. So voila, I just pulled up Hague. There's really no rhyme or reason why I built half the stuff I pull. So from one court of justice to another, the United Nations, commemorated in stamps in multiple countries, as you can get in Switzerland, and obviously New York City, so the United States, in Austria, and also Kosovo, because they had a temporary one there. And the predecessor to the United Nations is the League of Nations, shown here from a stamp from Switzerland. Isn't it striking? It's only men, the League of Nations. However did that nation grow? Perhaps Immaculate Conception was part of that breeding program. Who knows? So some of the stamps ever issued, the first ones ever issued by the United States, depicted political. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General of the United States. And other Postmaster Generals have included Abraham Lincoln, shown on the left. He was postmaster for New Salem, Illinois, and records show he was on his day. If somebody didn't come to collect the mail, he went and personally dropped it off. On the right, we see William Faulkner, author of Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Nobel Prize winner for literature. And he used to be the postmaster at the University of Mississippi. Though he was horrible at his job, he concentrated instead of reading and writing during his work hours. Nice work ethic. And apparently he used to often sit on sacks of unsorted mail. He couldn't be bothered. And in a lovely little story, he even inscribed a copy of his first book. It was a book on poem, The Marble Faun. He inscribed it to the postmaster, who fired him, and Faulkner thanked him. I guess we thank him too, he got to write. And family members were amused when the Postal Service dedicated a commemorative stamp to a rather lax postmaster. So Faulkner was given a stamp in 1987. So along with stamps, another important factor in the process of receiving a letter is the delivery system itself. So between 1789, when the federal government of the United States began, and 1860, so in less than 100 years, United States population went from 4 million to 31 million. So around 1848, when the gold rush started in California, California's population exploded, and so did the need for connecting this population with the rest of the country. And they did so with the United States Postal Service. So before there was overland postal delivery, existing delivery methods were time intensive and expensive. And it's really amazing to discover how this happened. So for example, in 1848, steamships were carrying mail from New York to California via the Isthmus of Panama. So Isthmus is a narrow strip of land. So you can imagine, so before they constructed the Panama Canal down here, ships reached Panama. So they got down to here, mail was taken off, transported in canoes or on pack animals. And later, I guess they used railroads. So all of this is coming. It traveled 50 miles to the Pacific coast side. And once it reached the Pacific coast, another steamship collected the mail on the Pacific side and headed north to get to Seattle and California, other places. One sees the great need to have an overland journey to deliver mail, not just the time. It's one of the reasons why it was so expensive to send mail. So historically, there have been key drivers for establishing efficient postal systems so that we could have this human connection. It's so important. One great driver for the postal services was trade. So throughout history, be it the Egyptians or the Chinese, commerce promoted business correspondence. Even for the largest land empire in the world, the 12th century's Mongol Empire, and it went all the way from Korea to past Turkey. Communication was essential for trade, and the Mongol scribes spoke and wrote multiple languages to facilitate trade because they covered a vast empire. And in the 13th century, Italian merchants had extensive postal systems by mid 13th century. The annual fair in Champagne was attended by merchants from all over Europe. And at that time, Champagne wasn't known for alcohol. It was known for alum, which was essential for the dyeing, for textile dyeing. Because remember, around these times, and it's telling because it's showing sheep in this picture, or what should be sheep, because England was coming into power slowly because the wool was their primary trade. So the wool had to be dyed. So alum was essential. And so because of these annual fairs, there were two fixed dispatches, one to carry orders by mail, and the second to effect settlements, that payment has been made before the merchandise was sent. So keep in mind the ripple effects of this postal delivery. Because they had crucial postal routes, hostels, what we would call, inns, were maintained along the routes. And so towns sprang up. So this postal delivery matters. Nothing happens in a vacuum. They all have ripple effects. A second driver for the postal system was surprising, but makes sense in hindsight, the printing press. With the subsequent expansion of education due to readily available books, more people became literate and they communicated through letters. So growth in demand made letter carrying a profitable business. So again, trade comes in. Money is a driver for so many things. Another driver for a more robust postal delivery system was improved roads. It just makes sense once you realize it. It's like, oh yeah, makes absolute sense. How will you deliver mail otherwise? So paved roads made way for stagecoaches and mail coaches. Stagecoaches and these mail coaches supplanted the mounted postboys who used to deliver mail. In America, it was the Pony Express. So the paved roads reorganized the entire mail system because letters in major cities like London could now be delivered overnight because the mail coaches were much faster and could carry more mail than individual riders. And just for humor, because it's funny what I discovered, I really wanted to include this. An unusual event occurred in October of 1816, where I guess the Exeter mail coach, while it was on its way to London, had drawn into Pheasant Inn. There is the namesake pheasant. And as you can tell in this drawing, the leading horse was attacked by a lioness, which had escaped from a traveling menagerie. So there was a circus nearby and the lioness escaped. The lioness then turned her attention, I'm going to point now, to this large dog, which had proceeded to attack her. Well, the lion devoured the dog. The lioness is, well, I guess lioness, not a lion. The lioness's owner eventually recovered her from underneath a nearby granary. And I was thinking, poor thing, that poor kitty was so afraid. Full tummy, but afraid. But what is so funny, look at the passengers. They all took refuge inside the inn, bolted the door, and stopped anyone else from entering. I just simply couldn't resist adding this bit of history, the thrill of snail mail. I'm pretty sure my mailman, no matter, or mailwoman, whatever happens, they aren't lioness and animals attacking them. So over time comes other modes of transportation. And I'm including this because all the ripple effects, the post office supports so many transportation. The amount of sheer transportation, the cars they buy now, fleets that they occupy, makes a huge difference. So we have ships, we have railway delivery, but we also have other things. Balloon delivery was implemented during the Franco-Prussian War. And it's so sweet. I'm going to point now on the top left, note the deliver by hot air balloon on the top, because that is akin to delivered by hand that some people affix to their letters even today. Things that I'm not including here, they used pigeons to send mail during the Franco-Prussian War, but there was a slight problem when the Germans found out, they used to send out hawks to catch the pigeons. But the bigger problem was people were hungry, so they shot down the pigeons to eat them. So there were so many things that I would love to include, but we can't. There's one must edit. Eventually, the horseless wagons, which is what the automobiles were initially called, were included in the postal service. And then airplanes became all part of the postal transportation system. And the US Post Office Department launched airmail services in 1918. And this is not a joke. This photograph was taken around 1919, and the employees delivered a woman who traveled as cargo to San Diego, California. Very soon, regulations were put in place, and which prohibits people from using the postal service for delivery. You've had stories of children being delivered by mail, but it was more cutesy, like their uncles or aunts were delivery people. And so somebody stuck a stamp on their dress and their aunt took them down a mile and dropped them off to grandma's house. It's really sweet, all the things that are part of our history. But moving on, another major, as what we call now, disruptor to the postal system was adhesive stamps. So in 1837, Rowland Hill reformed the entire cost structure of the postal operations by introducing a uniform rate of postage, regardless of the distance of the correspondence. So the public could prepay for post by means of these adhesive stamps that were sold by the post office. So this significantly reduced the price, and people started writing more because it was cheaper to do so. So here are some things that we now fail to consider, but were considered great innovations during their time. So simple things like perforations, these little holes, and these things are called teeth, which made it easier to separate a stamp from the entire page. Because prior to that, you had to use, as you can see in the next one, scissors to cut them out. Can you imagine how inconvenient that would have been? But that's what they did up to the mid-19th century. So this is obviously a more modern stamp, and that what is used now is die cutting. So you use special machines to cut the sides of the stamp. So effectively, most adhesive stamps now use die cut methods. But there were many other styles that were used historically. This one here is rouletting, where a small wheel, like the rowel of a spur, was used to cut lines in stamps of old. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of this, and they all had intricacies. So this one shown here was the serpentine roulette. It's really charming. The more one pays attention, the more one discovers. And all these things we now take for granted. So time constraints, again, prohibit us from delving into things that are really fascinating, like the social impact of post office. In America, there used to be, I didn't know this, ladies only section in post offices. So when mail cost was standardized, it made mail accessible to working women, middle-class housewives, and schoolgirls with pocket money. So, and these all have ripple effects, which we don't have time to look into, but look into it. It's really fascinating how change is made over time. But what I find to be incredible and a major driver and a marvelous embodiment of cooperation, the International Post Reform that resulted in the Universal Postal Union, UPU. It's represented in the stamp from Switzerland, so you can see UPU right there. Because I am amazed by the goodwill that undergirds the international post system. All members of the UPU, UPU again is the Universal Postal Union, all of the members, which includes nearly every independent country, act as a single postal territory for the reciprocal exchange of correspondence. So each postal administration of one nation relies on the postal authority of other countries to ensure that the mail reaches the destination. All this trust, though the charges for a letter are not shared. So each country retains the postage income, and the country in which the mail is delivered receives no payment. This principle was adapted in 1875 to minimize the need for complex international accounts. And it's justified on the supposition that a letter normally generates a reply. So if you're taking mail in without getting payment, when the mail goes out, when a reply goes out, you'll make money off that. That's the supposition. Developing countries sometimes get a short end of the stick. So there was changes made, amendments made in Tokyo, and there are money available for that too. But the principle of it runs on goodwill. I love that. I mean, the mere fact that it is goodwill that undergirds our global communication, our connection. Isn't that fantastic? Humanity in action. Mr. Barr, did you realize that when you love stamps? Isn't that awesome? Anyway, now that we have a bird's eye view of how mail is delivered, we will proceed to the product, letters and postcards. So, definitions again. An epistophile is effectively someone who loves letters. Reading another's letter seems such an invasion of privacy to me, though they are fascinating. So I'm not sure if I'm an epistophile. I'll readily submit to being a bibliophile, a book lover, but a letter lover, I'm not quite sure, although they are fascinating to read. So despite social media, teenagers, even today, are familiar with printed letters in the form of college acceptance. Though nowadays, this printed letter is more a formality because the students are made aware much earlier through the electronic application process, whether they got in or not. But it's very nice and exciting for them to receive a letter in the mail saying, yeah, you got accepted. Along with the acceptance letters, rejection letters are quite interesting too, and often karmic. Here's a letter from New York Museum of Modern Art, politely rejecting Andy Warhol's offer of his drawing, which is titled Shoe. Somebody is repenting somewhere. And it's so cute. The postscript is a polite, effectively saying, come and pick up your work from the museum. We don't want to take care of it. Can you imagine that? Another rejection letter to a Mr. Paul Hewson for his demo tape. Mr. Hewson is better known as Bono, and the band that was rejected is U2. These letters do make us chuckle in hindsight, don't they? It's that proverbial who's got the last laugh now bit. But a product that makes me smile, not laugh, and it makes all of us smile for the most part, is the postcard. So Penny Pennants is accepted to be one of the first official postcards from around 1840. This hand-painted design on the postcard shows an image of postal office clerk sitting around a giant inkwell. But even from 1840 onwards, there used to be decorated envelopes and decorated letterheads that were around from the mid-19th century all the way up. But it was effectively, and most importantly, the Paris Exposition that was a marking point for the world of postcards. And I encourage you, this is something that is available here, the Lake County Forest Preserve District, they have a Discovery Museum. There's a wonderful curator there, Kathleen Hamilton Smith. She's charming. And she has access, I think she helped put together the postcard collection that said the Fine Arts Museum in Boston, which is Leonard Lauder's collection of postcards. Marvelous. So if when the time is better, go up and see in the, or perhaps look up online, postcards. The newspaper Le Figaro made postcards available for those who climbed up to the post office that is located in one of the upper stages of the Eiffel Tower. So imagine the novelty of this all. Postcards were novel. The Eiffel Tower itself was a novelty. And so you would have to walk up to the top of the Eiffel, not to the top, to one of the stages of the Eiffel Tower to mail a postcard from there. And this is the picture side, the recto, which allowed space to write down whatever you wish to send to whomever you wish to send. And the verso, which is the reverse side, was available for the address. So back then, this address size, the business end of the postcard, you could not write any message. It only contained the address. And this is obviously a sample, not the actual one, not the recto for the postcard that we just showed. But postcards had become popular for advertisement, and people started using up all the space since they could only write on one side. And so people are always imaginative. Cross-writing became popular. Look at that. You write one way and then you turn the card over and you write all over it. Isn't that fascinating? It's amazing what one discovers. And it's truly, to me, like art. Look at it. And what's also I want to point out, because I'm trying to shorten up all the side things, but I hope you discover all this. The fact that you could write a note on the side of the address, this indicates that this postcard was sent after 1907, because that was when they changed the rules that you could write on the business end of the postcard. All these small things are fascinating. Cross-writing, isn't it marvelous? So in America, Chicago is credited as the birthplace of the American postcard, and this was around 1893 for the Chicago World's Fair. Attendees eagerly bought official souvenir postals, which popularized the idea of the picture postcard. And it set the stage for the private postcard industry to boom, which it did once the United States government changed the postal rate for private cards from 2 cents to 1 cent in around May of 1898. So this is all previous century. What is being rendered here is the Palace of Fine Arts for the World's Fair. It was one of many buildings that was erected solely for the exposition. And unfortunately, very few remain, even though they were built on a grand scale. So the Palace of the Fine Arts is now, as you can tell, the Museum of Science and Industry. And this exhibition of Andre Curtis was just concluded at the Art Institute of Chicago. This photographer, he used to use postcard paper to print his photographs of Paris. He was there for 3 years. And he then sent some of them sealed in an envelope to his family to remind them that he was well. And I found that charming, because isn't that still a very functional use of postcards, akin to a "I wish you were here" thing. So he sent messages through that. Again, time constraints prevent us from delving into postcards. And an hour won't really do it justice to this art form. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a remarkable online collection. The collection of Leonard Lauder itself is bewilderingly beautiful. So on the left, from the kimono-clad badminton player, and to the one on the right alerts us how postcards were slyly used for propaganda. Because you can see this abstracted mass of two-toned green soldiers. They're marching in rows with flags on top, representing Europe. But you see the Nazi flag in there as well, to include a Nazi flag and a French flag, along with the message, which reads in French, "Europe marches against Bolsheviks," making it seem that all of Europe was along with the Nazi party. It has been really difficult to edit this presentation because each of these subtopics warrant undivided attention. One must choose, learn to say no. It's useful to have that habit. And I'm happy with the choices I've made, and I hope you are too. So we will now focus on the heart of the matter, the letters themselves. Once stamped and delivered, when the process is done, they connect individuals. And how? So the movie that gets the essence of this human connection is 84 Charing Cross Road, a love affair between two people who never meet, but know each other thoroughly through letters. The remainder of this presentation is about the essence of letters, the human connection. That is what was recorded in that 3,000-year-old Egyptian letter from father to son that this presentation started with. And now, for balance, a letter from a mother to her son, a Feb Byrne, whom you see on the right, and she's looking at her son, Harry Byrne. They're in Tennessee. So in 1919, ratification, which means to give consent, ratification by 2/3 of the states was required to amend the US Constitution for the 19th Amendment, which was to give the women right to vote. Hawaii and Alaska were US territories, not states, and thereby 36 states were needed to ratify the 19th Amendment. Dear son, the letter starts, I wish you were home too. We have had nothing but rain since you left. Feb, who was then 47 years old, goes on to talk about recent visitors, and she asks Harry, who was then 24, if he will be home for Labor Day, because the letter was sent in August. The 7-page letter is written in pencil on lined paper. So between updates about their neighbors and Harry's siblings, Feb urges her son to vote for suffrage. She really spoke about the morality of the vote. Quotes, I'm glad that my son believes in my rights as a mother and as a woman. Goes on to say, and I pointed out, it starts there, don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats, writes Feb. So Mrs. Thomas Cat, referred to in the letter, was Carrie Chapman Cat, who had taken over the leadership of the National American Suffragette Women's Suffrage Association. So the rats were the people who wanted to ratify the 19th Amendment. So the letter, when it was delivered to Harry Byrne at the state capitol, he had arrived wearing a red rose, which signaled he would be voting against suffrage. But when the vote was called, Harry Byrne, the 4th member to vote, quickly voted aye, a change that sent shockwaves through the room. So this mother's letter and her son's actions gives me and countless women the right to vote. That is why the letter was included in this presentation. It is my way of honoring that Southern matriarch and the courage of her son, because I firmly believe individual actions, our private connections, make all the difference in the world. And we're not going to belabor the point, but the postal system is essential for democracy. What was sent to you last week in a reminder, because reminders are sent a week prior, in the description for today's presentation included a line from a letter that effectively said, well, skunky, good night. You will never guess, I am kissing you. What exactly I am kissing? Well, the one who wrote that was the lifelong lover of wordplay, Vladimir Nabokov. He was one of the most uxorious, besotted writers of all time, and possibly the most happily married writer of the 20th century. Every one of his books was dedicated to his wife, Vera. She was the sure center of his world, and Vera was the first reader of all her husband's work, as well as his critic, his editor, and inspiration. Many suspected that she had a hand in the writing itself, and some firmly believe Vera was the true author. It reminds me of that movie that came out about 2 years ago, The Wife, which has Glenn Close. But back to the letter, tinged with a sensuous immediacy of details, Nabokov's letter to his wife Vera is a record of rapture. They allow us to watch a man fall in love, moving from passionate attraction that mostly defines the beginning of a romance to the deep, calmer attachment of long-time love. Snippets from the beginning of their love. I'm going to read some quotes from them. So, because you're the only person I can talk with about the shade of a cloud, about the song of a thought, and about how, when I went out to work today and looked a tall sunflower in the face, it smiled at me with all of its seeds, close quotes. You can tell the man was head over heels in love. And he goes on to say, and the letters include, quote again, "You came into my life, not as one comes to visit, but as one comes to a kingdom where all the rivers have been waiting for your reflection, all the roads for your steps," close quotes. And it's really tempting to find in the migratory butterfly a figure for the lepidopterist Nabokov himself, because he was a butterfly lover and he had taught at Harvard. In fact, he was one of the teachers for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. History is really fascinating. But his own metamorphosis from a pretty boy to a lanky youth to a fat old man, all that transformation captures really well. Throughout all of that, what was his steady constant was his wife, Vera. And Nabokov's obituary had stated that their dedication to each other was total. And that sentence was a simple fact, not grandiloquence. And so our story now shifts to a Swedish-Finnish graphic artist from Helsinki, known as Ham, who designed, among other things, around 220 Finnish stamps during the course of 3 decades, 30 years. Crisp lines. And after Dürer, here's one of my favorite hairs. Look how beautifully it's done. A rabbit of note. Well, Ham's daughter, Tove, learned artistry while sitting on her mother's lap, on Ham's lap. And this little darling grew to become one of the most beloved authors in the world. She has a cult following even in Japan. Tove Jansson, creator of Moomin Troll. At least that is what she's most famous for. So this eccentric family of creatures with an expanding circle of friends, Moomin Papa, Moomin Mama, Moomin Troll, all their stories, the underlying theme is that of tolerance. The popularity of the Moomin family series sometimes make people overlook the fact, the complexity from where Tove emerged. Nazi and Soviet incursions in her beloved Finland show up very early in her works. And if one knew to look, one would see the fright of the innocent, which would later blossom into what is now known as the whole saga of Moomin. And these are coasters that I have. I mean, I love her work. And Tove spent much of her later adult life ardently trying to be recognized as a legitimate painter. And though she had many lovers, there was only one great love in her life. A sample from her letter is what I will read to you now. So it starts, quotes, "Beloved, now my adored relations have finally gone to sleep, strewn about in the most unlikely sleeping places. The chatter has died down, and the storm too, and I can talk to you. Thank you for your letter, which felt like a happy hug. You have never given me anything but warmth, love, and good cheer. Isn't it remarkable and seriously wonderful that there's still not a single shadow between us? And you know what? The best thing of all is that I'm not afraid of shadows. When they come, as I suppose they must for all those who care for one another, I think we can maneuver our way through them." Isn't that just so heartfelt? But what makes me swoon is the way that same letter pivots from heartfelt tenderness to gentle bluntness, because it goes on, the letter goes on and ends with Tove addressing her love. If you write in Finnish, could you please be a dear and use the typewriter? Your handwriting's a bit tricky sometimes. Isn't that so cute? Oh my God, to be loved by somebody like that, it's marvelous. Tove Jansson is worthy of your time. And if you do find her work, look it up in the library. I think you'll enjoy her. And the final letter for our presentation today was written to a 5-year-old boy, Noel Moore, as he was recovering from fever. The missive begins, I don't know what to write to you. Oh, I need to plug my computer. I'm so sorry because it says it's going to die in a few minutes. Sorry about that. I wouldn't want that to happen. So the missive begins, I don't know what to write to you. So I shall tell you a story about 4 little rabbits whose names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. So begins the letters which eventually become one of the most beloved books across, it's a book series across the world, Tales of Peter Rabbit. Beatrix Potter wrote picture letters to Noel, who was the 5-year-old son of a friend and former governess. So the tales are based on Beatrix Potter's real rabbit, the one that she painted, the one that I just showed you. That rabbit was named Peter Piper. Many of these letters are available online at the Morgan Museum, the Morgan Library and Museum. Do look them up. They're enchanting. Prepare yourself because your inner 5-year-old will smile helplessly. And as I read one of the letters, simply look at the pictures and the illustrations. So the letter starts, My dear Noel, thank you very much for your nice little letter and your mother's too. I was so glad to hear you had both come away for a holiday. We are going home on Tuesday after a good time here. We have lots of friends and live in a house just outside the town where it is all fields and lane. There are such funny little thatched cottages with sparrow nests in the thatch, go enjoy, and a pussycat sitting in every doorway. Indeed, the cottages are so little, I think they must have been meant for cats and dogs. My brother sleeps in a cottage belonging to a dog called Stumpy, a fine, solemn brown and white dog. He sits on a little mat on the grass plot, and when I go in, he gives me a large white paw, but he doesn't wag his tail. He is such a polite, grave, gentle dog, but so proud. I meet him out shopping in the morning. He looks at me sideways, but he never speaks. God, I love her work. Miss Hayward keeps the house, but it really does belong to Stumpy. It is quite a pretty story. Once upon a time, there was an old clergyman who had no family, and Stumpy was his dog, and Miss Hayward was his servant. And so when he died, he left his money to Stumpy, 10 shillings a week for the rest of his life. I am sure, I hope Stumpy will live a very long time. It is so convenient for him and Miss Hayward and Friday and Percy the cat to live all together on Stumpy's 10 shillings. I hope you will find a great many nests and get quite strong before you go home again. And I remain with love, yours affectionately, Beatrix Potter. It made sense to select letters by noted authors, Nabokov, Jansson, Potter, for today's story. The letters selected were once addressed not to the public, but for the quiet moments to their near and dear ones. And that is at the heart of epistles worth noting, isn't it? That is why The relatable letter from an Egyptian father to his son 3,000 years ago still resonates. Why don't you write to me? He admonished. Or perhaps it was his plea in the guise of a rebuke. It would be. It is this human connection, which is the thread of integrity across the ages. Then, as now, they are what makes letters and postcards so heartfelt. I treasure postcards and letters that I've received from friends and loved ones. And they're often festooned with more stamps than needed because they know I notice them. To make the time to include me in their vacations, in their joy, what is captured in these papers, in these letters, across time and geography, is the connection that leaves an indelible impression. Stamped. Yours truly, The Nourishment Projects. And if you liked this story, I hope you consider joining us next month, the title of which is Identity. And I feel so proud to have found this picture from the Alice in Wonderland series, the caterpillar very languidly asking Alice, who are you? I'm going to stop sharing now.